break, but before this, we still have one keynote speaker to go. So turning to the next keynote speaker, we are diving deeper into the topics like fundamental rights, discrimination and AI. And I'm happy to welcome here on a stage Dr. David Reichel, who is the project manager in the data and digital sector, European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And he will also present the report that provides analysis of bias in algorithms, including feedback loops in predictive policing and ethnics and gender bias in offensive speech detection algorithms. So happy to welcome here on site.
Okay. Thank you for giving me the floor. And first of all, thanks very much to the Estonian Human Rights Centre for the invitation of the Fundamental Rights Agency. It's indeed a very big pleasure to attend this conference and being here in person. I'm also fully aware I'm the only obstacle between you and your well-deserved lunch. So and we also ran a little over time, so I'll do my very best to hopefully give you a good and interesting presentation. I would like to start with a few words on the background, why we are working on AI and where the EU policymaking is currently at. Just a few words. We'll then give you a quick overview of what the Fundamental Rights Agency is doing on AI. And then, as mentioned, present a few results from our most recent report on bias in algorithms. There we go. So I like often starting AI presentations with this graph, which shows trends in searching these buzz terms, including artificial intelligence in green, in orange big data, or in purple machine learning. And it tells a nice story of what has happened in the past 15 years or so, because in the orange line, you see it was around 2010 when people started searching for the term big data. And that was exactly the time, if you remember yourself back when you had the first smartphone with social media apps on it, that was around 2010. And when you started sending thousands of data points to companies every day. So loads of data were collected because the chips allowed for sending more data. And then it took a while. You can see like only 2 years later, people started searching for machine learning, because with the data, you actually need to do something. And machine learning is the methodology where you can try to predict, to automate certain things based on data. And then it took little more while and people realized, oh, this technology we can also use for something that is called AI, which is still a very undefined term and is usually used for things that machines can do that were previously thought that only humans can do. I don't know where AI was also hyped in 2003, but maybe it's also a good reminder that it's just a fancy term that comes and goes whenever there are new technological developments. We see machine learning is really going on top, and I think that's also a good example that machine learning is the thing that we are mainly discussing at this stage. The EU reacted to these trends. It was around 2017 when the European Parliament started publishing resolutions highlighting ethical fundamental rights issues linked to new technologies. The Council of the EU got active and called upon the Commission to become active, which they did in 2018, creating high-level expert group on AI and deciding soon that there should be actually a law on AI. And that led to the proposed AI Act in 21. But before that, also importantly, AI is by far not unregulated. So we have laws that can deal with new technologies. The GDPR is the most famous one. It has several provisions, even though it's not always entirely clear how exactly they can or should be applied to AI. Also importantly to mention the Digital Services Act, which was adopted in November 2022, that especially has several provisions on calling for transparency, access to data on the large platforms, especially the very large online platforms. It will apply to the very large online platforms in the course of this year and next year also to the other service providers. That was the EU. Of course, also other actors at the international level are very active to come up with regulations that better protect fundamental rights when using new technologies. The Council of Europe, we heard Jan Claessen speaking this morning, very active on building a treaty on AI. The OECD is also very active, has principles on the use for AI. UNESCO adopted a global tool, recommendations on the ethical use of AI. And luckily, the international organizations are also speaking to each other. So there is a group where we exchange information, because we know very much that, especially at the national levels and companies, they're very much looking at the international level to see what kind of rules are actually coming up there and how they are interpreted. So it was around 2017 that also at the Fundamental Rights Agency, we started working on AI. And since then published a couple of reports dealing with different issues, one on discrimination and algorithms already 2018, but that was mainly based on desk research. Then we had a paper on data quality and AI, still a core question when it comes to the use of new technologies. What is the basis of training AI and how this impacts on fundamental rights? A paper on facial recognition technology in 2019, which is still a very important area of discussion, and where we also continue working on it in a new project that we started this year. Then we had a larger report called Getting the Future Right, including a horizontal analysis of different fundamental rights issues linked to the use of AI, feeding into the EU policymaking. And I will say a few words about this in a moment. And only recently we published a report on bias in algorithms, which I will present also in a moment. There are a few hard copies available of these reports over there. So if you still read hard copies, please help yourself. Yeah, on the general level, fundamental rights and AI, I would like to make 3 points. First of all, which was very surprising to me in the beginning, but it's still necessary when you come from a fundamental rights perspective to highlight that new technologies are actually welcome. They are quite useful. They make our life better and easier, can also help to improve the fundamental rights situation. So they should be, as I like to say, be used to the extent possible. The question is, what is the extent possible? Because we have clear rules in our societies that do not allow certain procedures. In our report, in our general report, we highlight 3 areas that have to be looked at a minimum whenever AI is being used. First of all, privacy and data protection. I think all of you are aware, data are used at a more and more granular level, revealing a lot of private information about people. So data protection is and remains at the core of using AI and needs to be checked thoroughly, always. Non-discrimination, I'll speak about it more in a moment. It took a while and people were not aware at the beginning of this discussion that they always thought technology is neutral. Unfortunately, it's not. So there are a lot of biases that can lead to discrimination. I'm coming back to this in a moment. And finally, an important fundamental right is access to an effective remedy. People have the right to complain when decisions are being made about them. You have the right to go to court or to a fair trial. And this is also often hampered by AI because it's used in an opaque way. It's intransparently used. And this way, it makes it difficult for you to have an equality of arms in front of the court because you don't know what was going on. So that's a very relevant fundamental right that can be solved through transparency and explainability. Then, of course, any other fundamental right is impacted because AI is a technology that can be used in all areas of life. And depending on the context, it may impact on any right that is included in the Charter. And that's also why we're advocating for fundamental rights impact assessments on a general level for each and system. You have to consider in context how these different rights may be impacted on. Now I would like to focus on biased algorithms. What's the problem? Why are we looking into this? We know there are a lot of examples already. We know there was a biased recruitment algorithm developed by Amazon, not used in the end. It preferred men over women, surprisingly, as it's based on previous recruitment practices. There was a chatbot built already years ago by Microsoft. It took a couple of hours and it spit out racist phrases. So the examples are manifold, and we know them. So we know it can happen, but we still have a lack of knowledge for concrete cases. And this is why we need more also empirical evidence to prove what's going on and where are the limits of using AI. And that should, of course, feed into these many ongoing important policy developments that are taking place right now. Before jumping into the results, a few words on what is bias. Importantly, bias as such is differently defined. For example, it's a technical term used in deep learning in a neural network. It's just one feature, one parameter in there that is not so relevant here, but also important not to forget. Sometimes computer scientists see bias as something positive. It means it works actually. It's biasing in the right direction. Bias is also a term coming from statistics. And in statistics, as we heard in the fireside chat, there's a lot about randomness included in AI, variance, but there's also bias. So that's in the statistics, the usual trade-off between bias and variance. Bias means you're missing the target that you actually want to target consistently. And this is linked to, but not necessarily the same as the one we are interested here. So we are interested in bias if it relates to differential treatment based on protected characteristics. So you're put at a disadvantage because you are a woman, because you are from an ethnic minority, because of your sexual orientation. And that's all the protected characteristics as they are listed in Article 21 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. As such, bias is normal in statistics, and machine learning is based on statistics. It occurs very frequently, but it always needs to be assessed in context if this is a problem, in fact, that can lead to discrimination. In our report, we have two examples how bias can occur, and we're trying to find out where it comes from and what impact it has. The first one is trying to show some empirical evidence on so-called feedback loops at the example of predictive policing. Feedback loops are defined as something when algorithms influence algorithms. And this is happening because if you're using algorithms, they should ideally have an impact on reality. They should influence the decisions. And then the reality on the ground is measured again, and that's becoming then the data for updating the algorithms in the future. So they are reinforcing themselves over time. This as such is also should be the case if they're working perfectly fine. However, if you have an unintended bias or something that should not go in the direction you wanted, then this can amplify over time and will lead to what is called a runaway feedback loop. So you're having predictions that are over-assessing the reality in the wrong direction. So we tried to simulate feedback loops at the example of predictive policing. So we used a simplified version, of course, of predictive policing and selected a few parameters with certain neighborhoods in an invented city. The neighborhood has a true crime rate, and that's the advantage of a computer simulation. We can assume the true crime rate. In reality, we don't know the true crime rate. Here we assumed different crime rates, and then we're working with police records. Police records were made of on reported crime on the one hand, and then on crime that is observed by the police on the other hand. And these records were then fed into a predictive algorithm that spit out allocations of police according to these predictions to increase the efficiency of policing. This is then, of course, again, influencing how much crime is observed and feeds further in the police records. So here the parameters in the police distribution was compared to the real crime rate in order to see what kind of bias we find over time. The results in a nutshell is that there are different sources, where the bias comes from. First of all, in most situations, there is a bias occurring over time. One of the sources is the machine learning model itself. Those of you knowing about machine learning know that they are quite sensitive to training data. They easily react to noise, as it's called, to randomness. And if this is not held back, then it can exacerbate certain biases out of randomness and lead to extreme predictions. The second one is crime reporting rates. You can take the simple example of two neighborhoods. In one, more crime is reported, in the other, it's less. Obviously, When you assume this is a good proxy for the real crime, you start sending more and more just to one neighborhood. And if you think that's simple, then you're right. It's very simple at this example that if the data are not reflecting the reality, it's probably not a good idea to feed it into an algorithm. However, the situation, we also tested more complex ways, also linked to crime observability, different crime reporting rates. Here at this example, you just see on day one, so days, we call them iterations. We only had a slight difference in the historical crime rates, but then the same crime rates, reporting rates and observability over time, but still because of the historical differences and the observability, it increases already after a year. We had a runaway feedback loop. These are just examples of remembering that when we influence reality and start measuring it, that certain errors we have can exacerbate themselves over time. We use the example of predictive policing, but it is also relevant for any other area. For recruitment, for example, if you use an algorithm for recruitment and you do not select a certain person based on the algorithm's recommendation, you will never learn if this was a good or a bad decision later on. Second example we used is ethnic and gender bias in offensive speech detection. So because it's difficult to scrutinize existing algorithms used by platforms and also to get a better understanding of biases, we built algorithms ourselves. So we were looking for social media data out there that were already labeled as including offensive, non-offensive speech as done by researchers or volunteers. And Amnesty International Italy, for example, provided a data set to us. And we had 3 data sets in 3 different languages, in German, English, and Italian. And for each of those, we developed 3 models. A very basic one, it only used the training data. It used a relatively simple algorithm, a logistic regression. It only used the words as features, as predictors. That was the most basic one. Then we had a more advanced one using word embeddings, meaning not just the words, but the words had scores, and the scores were more similar if the words were considered to be more closer to each other in combination with neural networks. And then we also used a highly advanced one. We used a so-called language model, was not ChatGPT, but the previous one called BERT, which also can be used for sentence predictions. And then we invented text, a lot of text, different sentences, non-offensive sentences, offensive sentences, and we varied them according to certain groups and words that indicated protected characteristics. Because in this experimental setting, the differences in the result is a direct indicator of bias against these groups. So here are the results. Obviously, certain terms lead to strong predictions of offensiveness, even if the text is not offensive at all. So here in the table, we use the example of a very innocent sentence. I am Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. In the mean is we also added random text sometimes to these sentences for different predictions. So it's an average prediction you see on the left side. 0 means it's not offensive at all. 100 means it's for sure it's an offensive sentence. So I'm Buddhist is on average 11, from 2 to 23, usually not predicted as offensive. Same with I'm Christian, may also be linked. It's also used as a name in English. And then you see it can go up. It goes up for I'm Jewish, 33% on average. And there's even some maximum predictions where some of the settings in an algorithm predicted this as an offensive sentence. And that's even worse for I'm Muslim, on average 72%, and one of the algorithms being very sure that this sentence is an offensive language. So this just reflects the very strong bias against Muslims and Jews already included in the training data. That is then reflected in the predictions to overly react to these terms. The results, however, varied quite across the models, the languages, and the ethnic groups. And that's not a very readable graph. I apologize for this. So what we can see here are the different groups in the upper panel. It's the false positive rate. So that's the percentage of sentences that we did not consider offensive that were predicted to be offensive by the algorithm. And large errors means like we have here for Muslim, gay, and Jew, that up to and even above 50% of the sentences we used were predicted to be offensive. What is interesting here is the differences for the different models, 1, 2, 3. Model 1, basic, 2, more advanced, 3, highly advanced. In the first two examples, it's the basic one that had the highest biases in there, but not necessarily, because interestingly, for the term 2 used, for example, it was actually higher for model 2. So there was something in the word embeddings that already contained this bias. Similar situation, but in a different direction, was in the German models. Here, interestingly, for the term refugee, actually, we had a very high prediction of offensiveness, almost all of them when the term refugee was included. So there was a strong bias in the language model, again, against this group. And then, again, another picture in the Italian model, again, where we could not really find a structure like when which model influences the predictions. This is relevant because the model 2 and 3 use so-called pre-trained general purpose AI. And this is, of course, also because it's not just the training data we used, but also the pre-learned models include some sort of bias. Aware of the time, we also looked into gender bias. We had the advantage in Italian and in German that we could use gendered nouns, which are usually not used in English. So here we have the example again of the term I am, sono in Italian. For the differences, and we on average found that feminine nouns are slightly more often predicted as offensive, but that was only a tiny difference on average. But still, for some example, we see the differences when you look at sono ebrea, sono ebreo, for example. I'm Jewish. The female version got lower scores than the male version. This is the other way around. For Muslim, Musulmana gets higher average predictions than the male version. And this is, of course, some indication that there's also intersectionality in the biases or in hatred in general included. That's, of course, only one additional dimension of gender inequality in online hate speech. So the ways forward, what can be done? So these are the recommendations that we included in our report based on this analysis. So obviously we know the story, we heard about it, but it's again important to repeat, we have to test for bias before you consider using an AI tool for automation. And this should be done repeatedly because, as we know, it can lead to changes that lead to discrimination over time. I did not go into detail now into the linkage because I only discussed bias, but there's still the open question, when does it lead to discrimination on the ground, like differential treatment based on protected characteristics? This could be in the example of predictive policing, that neighborhoods are composed of different ethnic minorities, for example. We did some tests in the speech detection algorithms as well on dialect predictions, where African-American dialect also increased the likelihood of having false positive rates. However, we also recommend there should be more guidance on when and how we can use data on protected characteristics for the purpose of discrimination detection, because the collection of data on protected characteristics is often seen as being at odds with data protection, and there more work is needed. So ethnic and gender biases are quite strong, especially natural language processing, and that always needs to be considered when such tools are considered to be used. At the same time, all grounds of discrimination are relevant. We've seen also sexual orientation included. All of them are relevant. Not all have the same protection in EU secondary law, but they should still be considered in all applications. It's also important to strive for more language diversity. It was relatively easy to work in English with these algorithms, but even in German and Italian, which is not spoken by few people, it was quite difficult to develop. So there's quite a too strong focus on English. I'm not sure how well this would work in Estonian, for example, or in countries with not that widely spoken language. So we actually, when we always discuss these amazing results of AI, we forget about the richness of languages and that it does not work well for many others. And the last point is to increase access to evidence-based oversight. It was not easy to get hold of good data sets for this tool, but as we also heard before, it is relevant to come up with the numbers to convince people where we have problems and to better understand where we can use AI safely and where it is not possible. Thank you.